This is a short guide to logic and arguments for use in a variety of courses in philosophy, just to get you thinking about how we think and how we present our views to each other. So, arguments are made up of propositions. Propositions are the basic unit of thought. Propositions are come in the form of an indicative or a declarative sentence, and it's functionally saying something about something. If you just say something like cows, you haven't had a thought. There's no real thought there. But if you say something like all cows are brown, okay, then you've had a thought. A proposition, a claim like this, is evaluated as being either true or false. So all cows are brown, for instance, would be false. And I would know that because I have seen at least one non-brown cow. That's all it takes for a claim, all cows are brown, to be false. So a definition of an argument then is a connected series of these propositions that are put forward to try to establish some further proposition, some further claim. There's a special relationship between the connected series of propositions on the one hand and the proposition that is intended to be established or proven or demonstrated, the claim you want somebody else to accept on the other. We call the proposition to be established, what you want to convince somebody or persuade somebody about, or even persuade yourself about, it's called the conclusion of that argument. The other propositions that we use to try to establish that conclusion are called the premises. Not promises, premises. And they can be taken either individually or taken together, but they are the reasons why we think the conclusion is true, why we should accept that conclusion. So how do we tell the goodness of an argument? Well, it's a two-step process. A good argument is both valid and sound. The definition of valid is this: an argument is valid if and only if it is impossible for the premises to all be true and the conclusion to be false at the same time. So you take all the premises, there could be 1, 2, 50, however many propositions it would take to establish the truth of the conclusion. You ask yourself, if all those premises were true, if they were all true, would it be possible in any way for that conclusion to still be false? If it would be possible, the argument's not valid. That means you could get somebody to accept your 1 or 2 or 50 premises, but they would still reasonably be able to reject your conclusion. But if it's impossible for that conclusion to be false while all those premises are true, then you have a valid argument. The definition of a sound argument is an argument that, first of all, is valid, as we've just described it, and all the premises are, in fact, in the real life, in real world, true, actually true. For validity, we're talking about possibility. We're asking what if? What if all those premises were true? Would the conclusion have to be true? That's one issue. The second issue is, suppose we decide that it is a valid argument. Yeah, if all those premises are true, the conclusion has to be true. Well, then we want to know, but are those premises true? Are they really true in real life, in the real world? If they are, then you would have to accept the conclusion. You would have to accept it. Why? Because it's valid. You said that if they were all true, you'd have to believe the conclusion. And then we went out and looked in the world and found out, guess what? All those premises are true. So the conclusion would have to be true. So arguments are not true or false. That's the terms we use to evaluate propositions. So no such thing as a true argument or false argument. Just like there's no such thing really as a sound proposition. I mean, it really doesn't make sense. Propositions are true or false. Arguments are first either valid or invalid. And second, if they're valid, then we can be concerned about whether they're sound or not. If they're invalid, we can reject them. They're just not put together well. So an argument is valid if and only if it is impossible for the premises to all be true and the conclusion to be false at the same time. Put another way, as we said, if all the premises can be true and yet that conclusion can be false at the same time, the argument is invalid. All right. Again, I'm emphasizing this. Can be true, can be false. In a way, I'm saying when you're evaluating the validity of an argument, you can set aside what you actually know about the way the world really is. Set aside what you know to be true or false about propositions. Just set that aside. You're just asking what if. What if they were true? Maybe they're not true, but what if they were true? The premises. Would the conclusion have to be true? We're talking about possibility. when we're evaluating an argument for validity, not the actual world yet. That's soundness. So you can write arguments in ordinary language in a variety of ways. Here's one. Dave likes the Phillies. All people like the Phillies like baseball. Therefore, Dave likes baseball. Look, for some reason, we're trying to give an argument that establishes what? That Dave likes baseball. Now, we know he likes the Phillies, and we know that everyone who likes the Phillies likes baseball. These are our reasons for thinking that Dave likes baseball. The word therefore in this example is what we call a conclusion indicator. When you notice a conclusion indicator, you will know that whatever comes after that, in this case the word therefore, will be the conclusion of the argument. And there's other conclusion indicators like so Dave likes baseball, or thus Dave likes baseball, or in conclusion Dave likes baseball, hence or ergo Dave likes baseball, and sometimes then, but not always. There are also premise indicators as well that we'll see. So we could say because Dave likes baseball, and since everybody who likes the Phillies likes, because Dave likes the Phillies, and since everybody who likes the Phillies likes baseball, we can conclude that Dave likes baseball. So because, since, again, sometimes, inasmuch as, given that, those are words or phrases that indicate that what comes right after them are premises. Now I said since and then sometimes are premise indicators or conclusion indicators because sometimes they're not. So if I say, first I got up, then I had coffee, all right, that's not an argument. It's not the reason I had coffee is not that I got up. It's just a time sequence. First the one thing happened, then the second thing happened. Same thing goes with since. Since 2020, since March 2020, I haven't been in a grocery store. Okay, now that's not the reason. COVID's the reason. I gave you a time sequence starting at a certain point, March of 2020, something's been going on, but it's not an argument for what's been going on. All right, does that make sense? All right. So arguments in ordinary language can be written in a variety of ways then. We could have written that argument like this. Dave likes baseball because everyone who likes baseball, likes the Phillies, likes baseball. And Dave likes the Phillies. We could write it that way. Or we could write or say, since Dave likes the Phillies, Dave likes baseball. Because everyone who likes the Phillies likes baseball. Or we could say or write, Dave likes the Phillies and all people who like the Phillies like baseball, so Dave likes baseball. Notice we've written in three ways, and the conclusion comes at the beginning of the first way, in the middle of the second way, and at the end of the third way. So it's not that the conclusion in ordinary language when we're talking to each other always comes last. It may not. It may come first or in the middle or at the end. Notice the red highlighted words. Those are the premise indicators. Shows you that what comes immediately after them will be a premise. The blue, the word so in blue, that in the third case shows you that that is a conclusion indicator, and what follows that again immediately is the conclusion to the argument. Okay, so when we evaluate arguments for validity and soundness, it's very helpful to put the argument in what we call standard form. Wherever they show up in ordinary language, we gather all the premises together in one pile, and we put the conclusion in the other pile, and we usually write it as you see on the screen there. With the premises, I'm always going to be using two. It could be many more than two. The premises above the line, and the conclusion below the line. And a lot of times we don't write premise one and premise two or conclusion. We just use the line. Everything above the line are premises in whatever order, and whatever comes below the line, that's the conclusion. And we just read the line as if it said therefore. That's it. Now, no matter how it's written in ordinary language, it's always the same here, right? The two premises are that Dave likes the Phillies and everyone who likes the Phillies likes baseball. Those are the premises. And the conclusion, again, wherever it showed up in ordinary language, is right there at the bottom. Dave likes baseball. And now, once you have that, it's easier to evaluate the argument, first of all, for validity. You ask yourself, what if all the premises are true? Is it possible for all the premises to be true and yet the conclusion somehow to still be false? Is that possible? You say, well, let's suppose Dave does truly like the Phillies. And let's suppose that everyone who likes the Phillies likes baseball. If those two things are true, it has to be true that Dave likes baseball. Otherwise, something went wrong up top, right? If those two premises are true, the conclusion has to be true. It's impossible for that conclusion to be false. When the premises are true, the argument is valid. Note, you don't know whether those premises are true because 1, you don't know who Dave is. 2, you probably didn't do a study that everybody who likes the Phillies likes baseball. You probably don't know that that's true. We don't. But in evaluating for validity, we don't have to know. We just have to say, okay, look, suppose Dave, whoever that is, likes the Phillies, whatever those are. If Dave likes the Phillies and everyone who likes the Phillies likes baseball, Dave likes baseball. That we have to accept. Okay? Right. So that's what that says. You can see this in the slides when I post them. Now, let's talk about soundness. For the reasons I just said, it's really hard to know whether this argument is sound. Right? It's hard to know. You know for sure that it's valid because you've asked yourself, what if? What if all the premises are true? Would the conclusion have to be true? Yes. Is it possible for it to be false? No, it's impossible. So it's valid. That I know. But whether it's sound or not, I have to go out into the world. I have to find out who this Dave is. I have to make sure I know that Dave likes the Phillies. And I have to somehow come to the conclusion that everybody who likes the Phillies likes baseball. In that case, if I find out that those two premises in real life really are actually true, then I must conclude that Dave likes baseball. Right? Soundness is where we run into trouble, right? Because to find out about the truth of claims as such, logic can't help you. Logic cannot tell you whether Dave likes the Phillies. Only Dave can tell you that. Logic cannot tell you whether everyone who likes the Phillies likes baseball. Only doing a poll or a survey, some kind of test will tell you that. You have to consult the world. What logic does is tell you the relationships between certain possible facts of the world. If Dave likes Philly is a fact, and everyone who likes the Phillies likes baseball is a fact, then you can conclude a further fact without doing any more research. Dave likes baseball. You can conclude that. The only arguments then that should really convince us of anything are the sound arguments, right? Because somebody could give you a perfectly valid argument. It's constructed correctly, but the premises aren't in real life true, so we don't have to accept a conclusion. If those premises were true in real life, yes, we'd have to accept a conclusion on the pain of being irrational. But if the premises aren't true in a valid argument, they don't tell us anything. Not in real life, right? We know about the quality of the argument as far as its construction, but we don't know how it connects up with the world. And I like to use the analogy of buying a lamp. You know, if you order a lamp and the lamp comes to your house and the cord is broken, it doesn't matter what you do to that lamp. You're not going to get any light out of that lamp. It's just not going to work. You got to send it back. That's what an invalid argument is. It just doesn't work. It's never going to work. You can get rid of it. But if they send the lamp to your house and the cord is connected and there's a light bulb in there and the light bulb is new and fresh, as such, right out of the box, it's a valid lamp, so to speak. It's a well-constructed lamp. It's great. But you're not going to get any light out of it until what? Till you plug it in to the electricity in the outlet. Then, when you plug it in to the electricity, and then you could get the light out of the lamp. Well, it's the same thing with a valid argument. It's like a perfectly constructed lamp. But unless it's plugged in, it doesn't give you any light. Doesn't really tell you anything. But if you plug it in other words, the premises are really true, that's the way reality is, then you're going to get a light shined on the conclusion. You're going to be able to see that it also is true. So you have to find out the truth of the propositions to make up the premises if you are going to determine soundness. So here are some weird arguments, again, just to get you to watch what happens. You know, roses are red, violets are blue, therefore sugar is sweet. Don't think to yourself, well, you know what, roses are red, violets are blue, sugar is sweet. That all may be true, right? But that's not what we're trying to find out. We're trying to find out if these propositions work together in a certain way, such that if the premises are true, the conclusion has to be true. Right? Well, let's suppose these premises are true. Maybe they are true. Would that by itself, roses being red, violets being blue, would that by itself make it the case that sugar is sweet And the answer is no. Sugar happens to be sweet, but it's not because roses are red and violets are blue. That's not why. Those aren't good reasons for thinking sugar is sweet. It's for some other reason. It's an invalid argument. And it's much easier to see if you say something weird where you're not, tempted to think, oh, well, because I see everything is true here, it must be valid. No. Invalid arguments can be made up of perfectly true claims, as we just saw. That in itself is not enough. We got to look for the connection between the premises and the conclusion, such that if the premises are true, it would make the conclusion true. Now here's another argument. Tiny has big ears. Elephants have big ears. Therefore, Tiny is an elephant. Well, you got to think about that for a second. Elephants, or all elephants, have big ears. That's what's implied here. All elephants have big ears. Tiny has big ears. Would those two things, let's suppose they're true. Elephants have big ears and Tiny has big ears. Both of those are true. Let's just assume they're true. I don't know who Tiny is. I know at this point. Let's just assume it's true. Would that mean Tiny's an elephant? No. It could be true that all elephants have big ears and Tiny has big ears, but Tiny could be a CEO of a corporation, or Tiny could be my dad, or Tiny could be a professional wrestler, or Tiny could be a hamster with big ears. So long as whoever Tiny is has big ears, premise number one is true. And premise number two, let's assume that's true. Those two claims by themselves would not allow us or give us the justification for thinking that Tiny has to be an elephant. Tiny could be elephant. Tiny could be something else. Tiny could be something else. And that means it's possible for the premises to be true and the conclusion to be false, which means this argument is invalid. How about this argument? The 2008 Summer Olympics were held in London. Any Olympics held in London are held in England. Therefore, the 2008 Summer Olympics were held in England. Well, let's think about that. Let's suppose that the 2008 Summer Olympics really were held in London. And let's suppose that any Olympics that are held in London are held in England. Let's just assume those two things are true. Would that mean that the 2008 Olympics were held in England? If premise one and premise two are true. The Olympics were held in London, and the Olympics held in London are held in England. Yeah, it would be impossible for that conclusion to be false if those two premises are true. It's a perfectly valid argument. If it really is the case that those Olympics were held in London and then any Olympics held in London held in England, if those things are true, those Olympics were held in England. However, the argument's not sound. Why not? Because the 2008 Olympics were held in Beijing, not London. So I don't need to be persuaded that the 2008 Summer Olympics were held in England because premise number one happens not to be true. Premise number two is probably true, unless we're talking about London, Ontario, or someplace else. But premise number one is definitely false. That's not where they were held, so we don't have to draw the conclusion. It's an unsound argument. Only the sound ones are ultimately persuasive. How about this one? All professors like books. Hillary likes books. Therefore, Hillary is a professor. Again, I'm asking myself, what if? What if all professors like books? I don't know if they do, but let's suppose they do. That Hillary likes books. Let's suppose those two things are true. Right? All professors like books. Hillary likes books. Does that mean Hillary's a professor? No, maybe she's one of those non-professor book likers that are out there. Who's an astronaut or a physician or a secretary of state or whoever, right? Other people besides professors like books. We don't know about all the people like books. We know about all professors. So if you told me she's a professor, I would know something. But you didn't tell me about all the people like books. Turns out some of the people like books are professors, if premise number one is true. But I don't know about all of them. Here's what I'm talking about. Look at the difference between these two arguments right here. All professors like books. Hillary likes books. Hillary's a professor. Well, we said, well, that's invalid. It's possible for the premises to be true and the conclusion to be false. But what about the second argument? All professors like books and Hillary's a professor. Note the difference. Now you told me something about all professors. Assume it's true. They like books. And then you told me Hillary's one of those professors. Well, guess what? She has to like books then, if those two premises are true. Vice versa, you could look at it this way. If you say all professors like books and Hillary's a professor and you conclude that Hillary likes books, perfectly valid inference of that argument. If you met Hillary and you said, you like books? She says, no. Are you a professor? Yeah. Then guess what happened? You found out that premise number one is false. Somebody told you all professors like books, but you just met Hillary, Professor Hillary, and she does not like books. So the claim all professors like books would have to be false. So you can work it both directions. A valid argument tells you about the relationship between the premises and conclusion. Invalid arguments do not tell you anything useful. Now, let's talk about something we call strong arguments. A sound argument, that's the ideal. That's a valid and sound argument. That is persuasive. That is completely, fully convincing, on pain of being irrational. If you agree that all the premises are true would mean that the conclusion is true, and somehow you don't want to accept the conclusion, there's something wrong with you. Right? A valid argument says if the premises are true, the conclusion has to be true. But in order to construct a valid argument, we have to use what we call universal propositions, and we've seen them in all of our examples. They take the form like all x's are y, or x's are always y, or no x is y, or an x is never y. And the problem with those kind of universals, the all and always, the no and never, is that they're usually exceptions. I mean, how many things can you think of where you could say all of these are like that, or it's always like that? I'm not saying there aren't cases, but there's a lot of claims like that would be easily proven false, because to prove the falsity of a universal proposition, you just find one counterexample. An x that isn't a y. An x that once upon a time wasn't y. Some x that is y. Right? You just find one exception. That's all it takes to show that they're false. And, right, to get a sound argument, you ask yourself if all the premises are true. Well, if they're not true, they don't tell you anything. Like the 2008 Summer Olympics example, being in London. Well, if that were true, then we'd know it's in England. It turned out to be not true, so now I don't know anything about the conclusion. It doesn't help. All right. So, if there's exceptions, people won't believe the universal proposition is true. So what do? We try to weaken the claim. We try to say something like, if the universal is all x or y, we say like, well, most x or y. Much harder to show that's wrong. All right, then you can't just get away with just one example. Well, just like, well, I didn't say everybody. I said most people are like this. So showing me one exception is not enough to change my mind about that. So it's a weakened claim. It allows for some exceptions without making the claim false. So what happens, though? If you have an argument made up of a weakened universal proposition, most x's are y, and m is an x, therefore m is a y, you don't get a valid argument anymore, because what you're saying is it's possible for those premises to be true, most x are y and m is an x, without m necessarily being a y. It could be one of those exceptions, right? When m is unusual. It's not one of the usual x's. It's one of those x's that's not a y, which happens every once in a while. So you don't get a perfectly valid argument, and therefore you can't get a perfectly sound argument. So basically, there's a trade-off. If we try to form arguments that are strictly valid, people won't be likely to agree that they are sound, because they're going to find exceptions to the universal premises that are required to make a strictly valid argument. But if we weaken the universal premise in order to get people to agree that our premises are true, then it won't be strictly valid. You'll still be able to say that the premises are true, yet the conclusion is still false. So our goal is to just try to be as persuasive as we can by making the strongest arguments that we can, trying to go back and forth between the premises that we want to get people from what they will agree to what we'd like to see them agree to because of what they already agree to. We want to try to get there by posing the strongest arguments we can. And that's a difficult goal. So just to wind up in this course, we'll regularly be evaluating arguments for their validity as well as their soundness. Our course papers or forums, as the case may be, will require you to make, as best you can, valid arguments, or at least strong arguments that for the conclusions or the views that you put forth. In philosophy, it's not just a matter of giving an opinion, but giving the reasons for your opinions. That's all important, and reasons why you don't accept a different conclusion. And listen, we might and we will argue over the soundness of arguments, because we will, argue sometimes over the truth of the premises that we assert. I mean, that's what people do. But just remember, there's no real arguing about the validity of arguments. Arguments are valid or not, strictly as a matter of logic. We don't really need to know anything about Dave and the Phillies in baseball to know whether we have a valid argument there. We don't even have to know who they are. We just have to understand the propositions as they're presented to us. So validity, we don't want to make that mistake. Valid arguments, that's objective, like a math problem. It's objective. Soundness, though, that's where the give and take comes in. That's where we need to try to persuade each other as best we can, allowing that there will be differences of opinion.